How many times have I read the Harry Potter series? Probably close to 20 or 30, I don't know. Every time I read it, again, I discover something new, and this time I've been thinking all about the representation of mental illness in the series. This video is going to be all about the representation of mental illness, and I have 7 things that I want to talk about, 7 characters and aspects of the story that I want to discuss related to mental illness. I never believed in love, love was for other girls, girls who were cooler and prettier than me. Hello everyone, my name is Jimena. Welcome to The Singing Bookworm. Today we're going to talk about the way that mental illness is portrayed in the Harry Potter series. A lot of this is pretty overt, but I wanted to discuss the way that the portrayal works out, and some of it is a little more my personal interpretation that might be pretty subjective. Some of it even goes a little bit against the more established theories or interpretations. So, this is all my opinion, and, take it or leave it. Tell me what you think. Argue with me. I can take it. I'm half Latinx. So, here are 7 aspects of how mental illness is portrayed in the Harry Potter series. Some of these ways that mental illness is treated are really empowering. Some are less so. Some are kind of ambiguous. There's a lot of nuance to the way that mental illness is treated in this series. Number 1 is Luna Lovegood. This one's pretty obvious. Luna Lovegood is referred to as Loony Lovegood, and she is constantly represented as like mental or just really eccentric, and that's a key point because eccentricity and insanity or looniness sort of overlap in the way that the students of Hogwarts understand like her personality. So this comes up a lot in the series, that people are called mental or cracked or loony or whatever. A lot of different adjectives are used. A lot of them because they are eccentric, because their motivations are not clear, because their actions are not necessarily expected. A lot of the people who are called mental or in some way referred to as mentally ill are not necessarily exhibiting any of the symptoms of mental illness. Luna Lovegood seems to be sort of not entirely in touch with reality in the way that she's portrayed by other characters, the way that she's understood by other characters, which is saying something in a world with like dragons and fairies and stuff. And the characters also see her as unstable and unreliable source when she and Harry are the only 2 to see the Thestrals who pull the school carriages from the train station up to Hogwarts at the beginning of their 5th year. She tells Harry to reassure him that he's just as sane as she is, and that is not very reassuring to Harry, obviously, because he considers her to be kind of not very sane, so he's thinking that she's grouping him into that box as well. So you could take this 2 ways. You could either say that it's J.K. Rowling's representation of how especially kids and people in a school environment might not necessarily understand what mental illness is and might throw around the terms associated with it to apply to anything they don't understand, or is anyone who's weird, who is outside the norm. Or you could interpret that J.K. Rowling herself has that bias or limitation in her vision. Really, it's up to you. Number 2 is the Gaunt family. The Gaunt family is a prime example of how the obsession with pure blood in the wizarding world can go really wrong, because their family has been inbreeding for generations, which has resulted in a lot of problems with their last descendants, who are the mother and uncle of Voldemort. And they're described as having a vein of instability and violence. Especially the 2 men in the family are portrayed as very unstable and erratic and prone to violence. This is a little difficult because there is a huge stigma around mental illness, that it makes you violent and more dangerous. So it's kind of unfortunate that those 2 things are associated. It would have been more interesting to me if it had just been said that they were violent and closed-minded and prone to anger without bringing in that idea of instability, because that seems like kind of a cheap shortcut and also kind of rubs me the wrong way. But number 3 is Nevilles Parents. In the 5th book, Neville's grandmother tells Harry and his friends that Neville's parents were tortured into insanity. It's basically what she says, by Voldemort's followers. And here's another moment where the use of insanity is kind of not very specific. It's pretty vague. Basically, anytime it comes up overtly, it is pretty vague and non-specific and actually not very accurate. Because actually what is going on with Neville's parents seems to be more like akin to traumatic brain injury, because they have their brain has been damaged by magic, by the Cruciatus Curse, which is a curse that tortures people. So it's more like brain trauma that causes cognitive impairments rather than mental illness. Cognitive impairments and developmental issues and that kind of thing is not the same as mental illness. They're two separate things. It's really great that there is representation for this kind of thing in the Harry Potter series, and I think that the characters themselves are treated pretty sensitively, especially Neville. It brings a lot of empathy to his story. And we really feel how hard it must be for him that his parents don't recognize him. So there's a lot of really good stuff there. There's, again, also that weird thing with terminology that's kind of like, But again, like when I said with the Luna point, you can interpret this as like J.K. Rowling not actually understanding what mental illness is, or you could interpret it as her portraying characters who don't really understand what mental illness is and just use insanity as a umbrella term for like anything to do with the brain that's like non-neurotypical or like whatever. Number 4 is Dumbledore. The idea of a mad genius, mad scientist, all that kind of thing is definitely not exclusive to Dumbledore, but he presents a really interesting example because in this case, more than any other, it really seems to be all about perception. We really get a clear idea of that because it's told to us through people like Ron Weasley or his older brothers Fred and George that Dumbledore is mad or barking or any of the other questionable terms that people use in the Harry Potter series. And it seems to be mostly based on the fact that he's eccentric. His motivations are not entirely clear. It's hard to understand what he's thinking and how his thought influences his actions. So he's seen as eccentric, so that is extended to him being seen as mentally ill. But then when we get to know Dumbledore better in the 6th book, it becomes clear that he is very logical, that he has very clear reasons for the things that he does, and he doesn't really seem to have any mental illness whatsoever. It would make sense that once we got to know him, this vague notion of like madness would dissipate because it's not really based on anything other than the idea that there's a correct way of being, an accepted way of being, and that he doesn't conform to it, which seems to come up a lot in this, which is really interesting in the case of Luna Lovegood as well. Number 5 is Remus Lupin. And here we're running into my own interpretation, which is clashing with the canonical and more widely accepted interpretation. J.K. Rowling herself has said that lycanthropy or like werewolfism is supposed to be some kind of metaphor for the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and that's an interesting metaphor. There are a lot of ways that it does not fit, that it doesn't really make like total sense, and there's also like some problematic aspects of that as well. So I think a compelling argument can be made for lycanthropy to be a metaphor for mental illness as well, and I'm going to explain why. Mental illness has been associated with the moon for very long, ever since it has begun to be studied in Western civilization. That's where the term lunatic comes from. Lunatic is defined as someone whose mental state is affected by the phases of the moon. Basically, it was theorized that mentally ill people became more irrational or different things like that at different stages of the lunar phases. And that really matches with lycanthropy, of course. Another way that this theory really works with lycanthropy is that it causes people who are afflicted with it to be ostracized. And of course, this also applies to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, especially because it was historically associated with being LGBT, and that was historically something that people did not want to expose their children to at school or whatever. So it would make sense that Lupin would be discriminated against in the workplace, that he would be forced to leave his job at Hogwarts once the truth came out about his affliction. But that also applies to mental illness. Mental illness has a stigma of danger. People often think that people with mental illnesses are dangerous, and I think that the idea that Lupin was forced to be locked up in the Shrieking Shack during the times of the month where he was affected, aka when he turned into a werewolf, sort of tracks with the idea of institutionalizing mental illness, locking people away for the protection of others, and especially if you're thinking of that idea of the lunatic, of the lunar phases affecting someone's mental illness, it would make sense that some people in asylums would have different treatments during different times of the month. This comes up even in Dracula, which I did several videos about. You can find them on my channel. There's a whole lot of weird, interesting things related to the history of the treatment of mental illness, and I think a lot of those track with the way that lycanthropy is represented in Harry Potter. Of course, mental illness is not contagious. Being a werewolf is contagious. No metaphor is perfect, otherwise it would be a boring metaphor. Number 6 is the Dementors. I think I'm definitely not alone in thinking that the Dementors are a representation of depression. I think maybe J.K. Rowling has even talked about this a little bit. Depression is not sadness. It is the absence of hope, the feeling that you're never going to be joyful again. That's exactly how the victims of the Dementors describe their encounters with Dementors. Dementors sort of suck the joy and hope out of a person. One of the things that I think is so beautiful about the Harry Potter series is that when Harry Potter encounters the Dementors, he learns how to fight back. A lot of times when mental illness in any way, even metaphorical, is represented in a story, we are given the idea that it's not treatable, that it's sort of like a death sentence or a life sentence or some kind of sentence. A lot of really not encouraging portrayals in media. But in the Harry Potter series, Harry is able to fight back against the Dementors. He's able to use positive thoughts. He's able to use his own emotions and his own perseverance to fight back against the Dementors, against this representation of depression. And I think that's really beautiful if you think about it metaphorically, because we need more representation like this, where you can combat the really horrible things that you might have to go through when you have a mental illness. There's a way to fight back. Number 7, my last point, is Harry's PTSD. What I just talked about with the Dementors representing depression, I think they can also in some ways represent PTSD, because when Harry first encounters them, he suffers from sort of flashbacks. He remembers the moment when Voldemort killed his parents. Obviously, that's an extremely traumatizing moment, and he's forced to relive them whenever he encounters a Dementor. That is very reminiscent of the idea of flashbacks, which is very closely associated with PTSD. A trigger makes you flash back to a traumatic event. With the help of Lupin, Harry is able to conjure Patronus, fight back against the Dementors, and stop suffering from those flashbacks. Later on in the 5th book, after he's witnessed someone die and he's been face to face with Voldemort in the flesh, it was extremely traumatic also for him, and he is having nightmares. He is very angry. He lashes out disproportionately to what's going on. This could be interpreted as him just being an angsty teen, but I think it could also be seen as him suffering from PTSD, having these anger issues or lashing out personality changes that happen with PTSD. Harry spends a lot of the fifth book making mistakes and being unhappy. And I think that's a real risk that J.K. Rowling took with that book, representing someone who up until then had been sort of like a pretty standard hero. But in this case, Harry became a much more nuanced character. When I first read the fifth book, I was not super into it, but looking back, it's become one of my favorites because of all this nuance that it brings, because it's not pleasant. It's actually something that I really enjoy because it just feels more authentic. It feels more important. It feels weightier. And I think it's also paved the way for other authors of young adult fiction and middle grade fiction and children's fiction in general to represent mental illness. Someone else that comes to mind immediately is Suzanne Collins, who wrote The Hunger Games. She also wrote the Underland Chronicles. Both of those series represent mental illness, specifically PTSD, really well, with a lot of nuance and a lot of bravery, because it's difficult to dive into these difficult subjects, these painful subjects that are not necessarily going to paint your kid hero, your protagonist, in a good light. And this is something that might be kind of taboo, especially for young adult or children's literature. But I think J.K. Rowling paved the way for sort of mainstream children's literature to deal with this sort of thing. That's something really cool that came from the Harry Potter series. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please like and subscribe. I post new videos every week lately, and for the next few weeks I'm going to be posting 2 a week, so you're going to have a lot of videos to watch. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so that you are notified right away when I post a new video. If you want to get the first chapter of my upcoming young adult fantasy novel, The Relic Spell, you can sign up to my newsletter. I'm going to put a link right here. Joining my newsletter will also let you know any updates, any news, any stuff that you need to know to keep up with my books and with all the stuff that I'm doing. I will see you next week. I never believed in love. Love was for other girls who were cooler and prettier